Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all, and I hope what I have to say will be of some use to you. The picture here is of a farmer in Honduras. 7 years before this, his soil was about as light-colored and brown as any soil here in Africa. You can see it's changed. That's because of the green manure that's climbing up the maize behind him. And he's showing us one small ear in his left hand that is what he used to harvest from each stalk of maize. Now he harvests two of the larger ones. You can see the change in color of the soil. But the thing I most like about this photo is that his son, who's about 19 years old, is sitting there, and he's still living in the village. We have had at least one experience in Honduras where we were able to go from having an average net out-migration from the villages of an area called Winope of about one family per village per year. At the end of the program, 10 years later, there was a net in-migration of about one family per year. Because the farmers were saying, well, several reasons, some of them very interesting, but farmers were saying their kids had a future, and they knew they'd never have to go hungry again out in the village. And furthermore, they were respected because even the people in town knew they were now capable of growing any vegetable you could ever name and all sorts of other things. And when they went to the city, the middlemen crowded around them because they knew the farmers from Winope had the best vegetables in the country. So it is possible to at least slow down and stop, maybe not reverse, I've only seen that happen once, but stop the out-migration from the villages. Our villages here in Africa are actually dying. I think most of you know that the average age of an African smallholder farmer is over 50 years, and it's climbing every year. Okay, we can and must end what has been called by the United Nations the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Now, when that was said, that was 2 years ago. At that time, there were about 20 million people in Africa, and also including Yemen, who were in desperate need of food aid. The calculation this year is that somewhere between 30 and 50 million people are going to be in serious need of food aid. And the bad news is that that's not going to slow down, it's going to continue to get worse. Okay, not only are they getting worse, but they're being caused by something other than just lack of rain. Back 30 or 40 years, droughts were caused by a lack of rain, and before that. There are two factors that are very important about that. First of all, there was nothing much we could do about the lack of rainfall. I mean, we could grow trees and so forth, and maybe 50 years later there'd be an improvement, but you know, there wasn't much we could do. Two, the droughts were self-terminating. The rains came again, and it was all over. We could take our food aid somewhere else. That's not the situation anymore. And we need to change how we deal with the rapidly growing problem of droughts. As somebody said earlier today, before the 1980s, bad droughts occurred in the Sahel once every 10 years. Now they're occurring practically every other year. I was just in southern Mozambique, and they have had 4 straight droughts without a break. Okay? Most of their animals have died, and I suppose the next thing is going to be the children. Okay, now, the droughts will just get worse and worse for decades unless they're dealt with. Unless we figure out what the problem is and deal with it. But the good news is we can prevent that from happening. Okay, but if rainfall is not the real reason these droughts are occurring, what's going on? I mean, that's kind of a weird idea that you have droughts that aren't caused by lack of rainfall. People talk about climate change. I believe in climate change. I've believed in it since I saw it causing irregular rainfall all over the world in the 1970s. Okay? If you've ever noticed, farmers before the 1970s used to plant by the calendar. I have never visited anywhere in the last 20 years that farmers were planting by the calendar unless they had irrigation. Okay? Rainfall irregularity is definitely caused by climate change and definitely affects farm production. But those factors and also has caused in some places in Africa a certain decrease in rainfall, but usually not more than 10%. I mean, if you look at the statistics, you'll find that rainfall in Africa over the last 40 years has not fallen anywhere by more than about 10%, maybe 15%. So what's going on? Somebody want to make a guess?
Yes. Destructive development.
Okay, that's part of it, but also a rather small factor. Soil. At the same time, the 1980s, when meteorologists began realizing that droughts were getting more common, you know, one about every 5 years, and then it became one every 3 years, and I don't know what the latest average is, but it must be down around at least one every 2 years. Okay? In southern Africa, most of southern Africa, we've had droughts 3 out of the last 4 years. Okay, soil is the major cause of the droughts. Probably 70% of the problem is due to soils. Now, how can that be? Well, because fallowing, you know, what some people call slash and burn agriculture, but fallowing is in its death throes. Why? Because of population growth. Land holdings of farmers have gotten smaller and smaller. Right now, well, as of about 6 or 8 years ago, 80% of smallholder farmers had less than 2 hectares in Africa. Okay? 80% had less than 2 hectares. If you were going to fallow at that point, have a 10 to 15 year fallow like farmers did for 2,000 years, you'd have to leave 3/4 of your land in fallow and make feed your family off a half a hectare. It's not going to happen. Okay? So fallowing is ending. There are very few areas in Africa where fallowing even exists anymore, and where it does, it's usually just 2 to 4 years, which can only have minimal impact. For 2,000 years, up until about the 1980s, African soil was relatively fertile. Since then, it's taken a nosedive, as everybody here has been saying. If soils had been getting bad as fast as they have the last 20 years for 2,000 years, we would be living on rocks. Okay? The soil stayed fertile for 2,000 years. Why? Because of organic matter. And I'm going to have to disagree with Ken a little bit. During those 2,000 years, nobody had chemical phosphorus, and nobody had rhizobium, yes. I was looking inoculants, okay? And in our own work, I'll mention it right now since I'm into it, we have worked with thousands of farmers, hundreds of thousands of farmers actually, on 3 continents. And we use neither inoculants nor phosphorus. You do have to start out with the right plant. If a soil is really, really bad news, for instance, it's complete wasteland where they don't even graze cattle on it much anymore, we will start out with jack bean, Canavaliensiformis. Usually within 3 years, farmers are harvesting about 3 tons per hectare of maize, okay? That's 2.5 times the average smallholder production of maize, according to official statistics, which are not real reliable. Usually the yields are lower than that. Okay. The disadvantage, of course, of using our approach is that it takes 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to get a large, a doubling and tripling of yields. Whereas Ken is he's getting a doubling in 1 year in many cases. The advantage is we don't have to worry about inoculants. The farmers don't have to have a penny in their pockets. They can basically do the whole thing for free. We don't have to worry about getting inoculants into the local stores. We don't have to worry about people buying phosphorus fertilizer. By the way, the whole thing about, I don't know if you heard in the 1990s, scientists were telling us that Africa was headed for a phosphorus crisis within 10 to 15 years. Well, it's now, 25 years? Hasn't happened. The reason is that most soil analyses and so forth detect only the available phosphorus. And when you put organic matter in the soil, the availability of the phosphorus that's there doubles and triples. Okay? I have worked with farmers that have been using green manures with no chemical fertilizer for 40 years and 50 years, and they still are not having problems with a lack of phosphorus. I can go into those reasons in the session this afternoon if you wish, but phosphorus is not a major problem, okay, as long as we're getting enough organic matter in the soil. Okay, now how can I be so sure of this? I mean, this is a pretty weird thing to say that, well, you know, droughts are caused by soils. I mean, they're supposed to be caused by lack of rainfall, right? I have 6 pieces of independent evidence of varying degrees of importance. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the increase in droughts and the decrease in soil organic matter both of them started simultaneously in the 1980s. Could be circumstantial evidence. Second, the penetration of rainwater in the soil after 3 to 4 hour downpour. If you go out in the fields of most farmers, unless it's a very, very sandy soil, you'll find that the water hasn't gotten any deeper than that. Okay? I've done this many, many times on degraded soils. Sure, if you've got a soil where they've been using green manure cover crops for 10 years, it'll be a totally different situation. 3, rainwater infiltration has reduced, and this is according to scientific studies, from about 60%, which it was traditionally, to 10 to 20%. That means 1/3 to 1/6 of all the water that used to be going into the soil is running off. Okay? Because of soil degradation, because of lack of organic matter, basically. 4, I made a prediction, both in the book called State of the World 2011 and at one of the previous ECHO conferences about 4 years ago. Stuck my neck out. I mean, professionally, I was a little worried about it, but I felt I had to do something for African farmers. I predicted that there would be a major African famine within 5 years, and that it would affect at least 10 or 12 countries, most of them, well, all of them, lowland, drought-prone countries, okay, across the Sahel, down the east coast of Africa, and then back across through Namibia and Malawi, okay? The UN officially declared a famine 3 months after that 4 to 5 year period would have ended. And they named the countries, and I was only wrong on Ethiopia. I didn't include Ethiopia. All the rest of the countries I mentioned were among those having problems. So it was a problem that has been building gradually and was predictable. My prediction right now is it's going to get worse and worse and worse until we get serious about doing something about it. Okay? As of that declaration of an official famine, 10 million people were in danger of having severe hunger unless they got food aid. And thank goodness most of them did get food aid. Right now, last year it was about 20 million. This year people are saying it could be anywhere from 30 to 50 million people that are going to be in desperate need of food aid. And the World Food Program is getting tremendously stretched. Okay? We are talking about an extremely serious problem that hasn't been seen yet because of the tremendous number of trucks. I've been out to villages where there was just a stream of bicycles with food sacks on the back. You know, going out to the villages from distribution centers. It's an extremely serious problem and we need to face it. 5, the occurrence of both droughts and floods occurring in the same years. Farmers in Kenya, Malawi, and Mozambique have asked me at different times, what's going on? do we have too much rainfall or too little? We have droughts, and the same years we have droughts, we have floods. What's going on? And I'll say, well, when it rains in your village, even if it rains really, really hard, how deep is the soil, how deep is the soil moist? And they'll say, oh, about that much. And they'll say, oh, okay, so what's happening with all the rest of that water? Oh, it's flowing away. So I'll just stand there for a minute and they'll say, oh, I see. That's why they're having floods the same year we have droughts. Okay, the most important evidence we have that this is all a matter of soils is the impact of green manure cover crops, where they've been used for at least 5 years. Okay, now it does take a while to get we get soil fertility, definite soil fertility benefits by the end of the second year, and they could keep on increasing. But it takes longer to get impacts in terms of drought resistance. But let me show you a couple of photos here. This is a field in Madagascar. Obviously there was a drought. You can see the very, very tightly curled leaves on the maize. Even the cowpea is just growing in little clumps instead of covering the soil. But the maize is, shows it most clearly. Now, if you look at the top third of the photo on the right-hand side, the right-hand third, you'll see there's something green up there that's quite large, quite tall, almost solid green. That's this field. Same field, same woman owner. The only difference between those two fields is that on this field she'd been planting that cowpea you see there. It's a 9-month cowpea, rather rare, but nevertheless a 9-month cowpea. She'd been planting it there for 6 years along with her maize. In the other field, this was the first year she planted the cowpea. In other words, the presence of that 9-month cowpea is the only difference between this field over a period of 6 years and that field. Okay? Total drought resistance. Okay? And frankly, for farmers, this is more important than just increased yields, because farmers, smallholder farmers that can't store grain for very long, would much prefer to get a decent harvest every year than get a huge harvest one year and no harvest the next because of drought. This is extremely popular. And in the places I've seen this happen, like eastern Zambia here and also in Mali, in the Dogon area of Mali, I've seen this same phenomenon occur, as well as parts of Guatemala and Honduras. And boy, when farmers realize they may not have to suffer from droughts anymore, they really get excited. Okay? In this photo, you can see there are some curled leaves where the vetiver grass that was already planted there before this maize was planted, some of those leaves are curled on the right-hand side. But on the left-hand side, they're flat as a pancake and dark green. So there's been both a tremendous increase in soil fertility as well as a tremendous increase in resistance to drought. And like I say, I've seen this happen in at least 5 different countries around the world. I know it can happen anywhere. Except, okay, the one big exception is where you have soil with a pH of less than 4.5. That's where I would agree with Ken that we need some other amendments or something else to get things going. But where we have any other kind of, well, okay, if you have salinized soil, if you have polluted soil, you're not going to be able to do this sort of thing. But in what I would say at least 90 to 95% of the African continent, you can do this. Okay? You can dramatically increase the fertility of your soil, and you can achieve drought resistance, almost total. Now, it does take time. Like I said, the soil fertility is going to take you a couple of years. The drought resistance is going to take, maybe in 4 or 5 years you'll start seeing a difference, but this took 6 years, and that's been the case in most places I've been. Okay? 6 years. By the way, in this drought year, this maize here was producing approximately 6 times as much as the drought-affected maize in the other photo. Okay, so what can we do? The only solution is to build up soil organic matter in farmers' fields. When we do that, phosphorus will take care of itself. The only places I've ever seen a phosphorus deficiency any 40 or 50 years is in central Cambodia, certain places in Rwanda, and on the Kalahari sands of western Zambia, and in all three cases the pH was below 4.5. Okay? There's not enough animal manure to do this. I mean, animal manure is great. We always teach farmers how to use it, and especially to store it well. But animal manure, there's not enough. If a farmer has enough to increase the fertility over time of say 2 hectares, he or she's going to have somewhere around 15 to 25 cattle. Okay? Most farmers that have that much aren't poor farmers anymore. Compost takes far too much work. Okay, it's a wonderful thing. For vegetables, it will pay for itself. On basic grains, it usually won't. And like it says here, green manure cover crops can produce over 25 tons per acre of fresh organic matter each year. That's green weight. Okay? Have you ever in your life heard of any smallholder farmer producing even 10 tons of compost in 1 year? Raise your hands if you have. Somebody knows of a farmer that made 10 tons of compost in a year? Okay. My case is made. Okay, what large amounts of biomass can do? This is the one time when I saw a farmer do it. He was trying to prove us wrong. He'd started out in the program, this was in 1981, where we were talking a lot about organic matter. And so he decided he was going to see if we were really telling the truth. He made 16 compost heaps and piled it all on the left-hand side of this photo. And, well, I'll just point. Here's a row of maize starting here where the arrows are. You can see that row of maize. This row of maize here is about half as tall as the rest of the maize, okay? Which is producing very well, thank you. That is all the same variety of maize planted the same day. The only difference is that starting here, he dug a tremendous amount of compost in the soil. He was going to see if this organic matter stuff really worked. He was so embarrassed by what actually happened because he was proven so wrong that he didn't invite us to see the plot until the experiment, until the day I took this photo. The second row there obviously had sent some roots over and stolen some of the compost from the third row, but you can see the tremendous difference between this maize here and that maize there. That's all because of soil organic matter and maybe having turned over the soil. Okay? That's the only difference. Organic matter can make tremendous differences in soil productivity. Okay? Now, the question becomes why do we still see maize like this so often? The reason is putting compost on maize is anti-economic. Conrado never again made very much compost, okay, because it was too expensive. But that's what organic matter can do, and it can do, like I said earlier, in virtually all the soils of Africa. So it turns out, I mean, what this all means is that soil improvement is not a chemical problem, it's an economic problem. How can we get enough organic matter in the soil at a cheap enough price so it makes it worthwhile? Okay? It's just an economic problem. And the answer to that question, how can we do it, is green manure cover crops. Okay, now, green manure cover crops, I'll just very briefly mention what they are. They're any plant, including trees, bushes, vines, crawling plants, any plant that can is used by farmers either to fertilize the soil or to control weeds. Okay? Now, actually, as Ken and some of the other people said, farmers are only going to adopt green manure cover crops on a large scale if they do something else in addition to that. They provide us with food, they provide animals with fodder, they provide any one of who knows how many other benefits, including things like rat poison. We have a tree we frequently use that has a very powerful rat poison. And in southern Mozambique, where I was last week, people were really happy about that. Okay, the advantages: more soil organic matter and increased soil nitrogen, meaning greater soil fertility. Some of these green manures will fix anywhere from 120 up to 400 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. That's more than any North American farmer would ever put on his soil in a year, okay? We don't have to apologize for the amount of nitrogen that these different legumes can fix. We can get up to 4 tons per hectare of maize at virtually no cost, okay? Now, like I say, it takes more time than what Ken was talking about, but smallholder farmers can do this. 2, high protein food for people. That's extremely important. Lab beans, for instance, are half again as nutritious as common beans. Okay, that's very important. Furthermore, you can eat the leaves. And furthermore, beyond that, you can dry the leaves and store them for 12 months so you have a permanent, almost free source of high-level protein all year long. That is a nutritionist's dream, okay? Dry season fodder for animals. In some parts of Mali, they call the Gliricidia tree, which is a green manure cover crop, they call it the tree that saves our animals, okay? That's, for them, the most important thing it does. It saves their animals. They make it through the dry season. Help in controlling weeds. Boy, I'll tell you, few things will excite village women here in Africa as much as knowing that they only have to weed their maize once if they can grow something like lab in it. And we do intercrop lab with maize. 5, a farmer in eastern Zambia who was working with an NGO called Komako was showing us his fields where they'd been growing Gliricidia in the fields for 6 years. And one of the visitors with me said, "What's going on here? Your maize is like this, and everybody else's is like this because there's been a drought." Was there no drought on your field? Did the clouds all of a sudden start raining when they got to your fence line and then they stopped again? What's going on? The farmer sort of got a wry smile on his face and said, "Those of us that planted Gliricidia here 6 years ago have prohibited the droughts." We don't let them come on our farms anymore. 6, sequestration of atmospheric carbon, reducing climate change. A lot of the world's top scientists, including members of the IPCC, are now saying and writing articles saying that by far the cheapest and easiest way for humanity to sequester carbon from the atmosphere is, and therefore meet the goals of the Paris Accords, is by sequestering carbon in the soil. That's where the carbon came from, and then the soil can definitely hold that much carbon once again. Okay, some people say, now, what do you mean they're fixing 100, 200, 300, 400 kilos of nitrogen per hectare? These are nodules from one single plant of mucuna. Now granted, the farmers, in order to do this, cleared a whole area about 15 meters wide, so the plant wouldn't have any competition. They just wanted to see what would happen, because they'd already seen some golf balls, we call them, of nodules this big, so they wanted to see what would happen if they really gave the plant a chance. What are the things that keep farmers from doing more than, say, 1/4 of a hectare of CA year after year after year? First of all, hauling the organic matter to mulch the fields involves way too much work. Okay, there are more than 100 different species being used. I don't have time anymore to go through these. Jack bean is by far the best plant to use in really, really poor soils and in really droughty areas. Jack bean is what you ought to start with. Lab beans, people have already talked about them. They're an absolutely wonderful green manure cover crop. Gliricidia. Not well known. It does exist here in Tanzania and Kenya. In fact, in some villages in Tanzania, I understand they use it as a fire protection for planting it around villages. It's an absolutely wonderful tree. It will fertilize the soil very well. It also provides fodder for animals the last 2 months of the dry season, or the entire dry season if you manage it correctly. So also the other idea of green manures, they're called green because we're supposed to cut them green. They're called manures because we're supposed to bury it like manures. We don't do that. It's too much work for smallholder farmers. We don't bury them. We leave them on top. That has a number of benefits, and one of them is what you people working with CA are very conscious of, and that is we all of a sudden have all sorts of cover for our soil. Okay? So yes, we call them green manure cover crops, but they are not the traditional green manures as used in the United States, Europe, or Australia, or some of those places.